morning, everybody. And I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank Men's Voices Ireland for inviting me, and David for inviting me. I'm sorry I was late arriving. I got a crutch. I'm not used to being on it, and it slows me down and everything, so I couldn't kind of run here and walk at a fast pace. I had to hobble along. So I'm sorry for detaining you and keeping you waiting. Yes, my talk is Men, Health and Society, and it's a broad talk. I look forward to questions and maybe disagreement with you. I know sometimes men feel hated and undermined and all of that, but I think because of some of my views, I am probably even more hated. So I can feel your pain, as Bill Clinton said. Okay, away we go. Right, in Ireland, I first became, and I think a lot of my colleagues who are concerned about men's issues and women's issues as well, but men's issues because they're hidden, first became aware of this trend in Ireland with developing the Exploring Masculinities program. Do you remember that in the schools in Ireland in the late 1990s? And I remember watching a program on television about it, and it was very focused. This thing was trying to explore the changing role of masculinity in Ireland, and worryingly exploring the construct of gender, the social construct of gender. And it is true that gender is a social construct, but it differs from sex. So sex, male and female, is biological. Gender is what society does to each of those and how it molds them. The problem is the two are used interchangeably now, and the fashionable word, even in research, is gender. So when you read research papers looking maybe at depression in men and in women, the heading won't be sex differences, it'll be gender differences. So exploring that and discussing the disease, that was all part of the Exploring Masculinities program in Ireland, which was not a great success. It seemed to fade away, but some of the ideas from it were carried forward. In particular, the idea that biological sex doesn't matter, that gender is the important thing, and that gender is fluid. And we now come to 2018, and we have similar concepts, only in more extreme form, discussed and supported by the American Psychological Association, the APA. Now, there are two APAs in America. One is the American Psychological Association, and the other is the American Psychiatric Association. I'm a psychiatrist, this was the psychologist, so don't blame me for anything they have said. And last year, they wrote a document, which some of you may be familiar with because it got a lot of media coverage, because these big bodies, particularly from the United States, are very powerful, and they get a lot of media coverage across the Western world. And they wrote that traditional masculinity discourages men from being intimate with others and is the primary reason why men tend to have fewer friends than women. It claimed that it was based on 40 years of research. So I had a look at some of they cited for that sentence that this is based on 40 years of research from the APA. I looked at the two references that they cited to back that up, and I thought it might be a thing called a systematic review, which reviews all the quality literature. But no, the two pieces of research that they claimed were based on 40 years were from their own position statements previously. So they didn't cite any primary research to back up their claims. And they drew a lot on the work of a man called Ryan McDermott. What is gender in 2010s? It is no longer just this female and male binary. So he was promoting the idea of gender fluidity. And it stated that masculinity, which they call toxic masculinity, was anti-femininity, it was achievement-focused, violent, and it eschewed weakness. And they had one section devoted to African American men who in America were successful, and they accused these of John Henryism. And John Henry is not a man who should be accused of anything negative. He should be a role model, in fact, for African American men. There is a statue devoted to him in a park in Virginia for what he did. And he was a man, he was a worker, a laborer with the locomotive factory, with the train factories. And he himself tried to, when they were just introducing the engines in the US, he tried to beat an engine on a journey between two cities. And he did, he ran faster than them. And so he became a hero, understandably, for his determination, his desire to achieve things that others weren't achieving. And yet, the APA are accusing men like him in America today of John Henryism because it's an accusation, it's not an accolade anymore, it's a disparagement to be a black American achiever. That would appear to be the perspective of the APA. They also questioned some of the research on depression. Now, I'll be just talking about all of this in a moment, about mental illness in the sexes. We know that depression is much more common in women than men, but in their Toxic Masculinities position paper from last year, they're questioning some of the screening tools for depression in men. They say they work for women, but they don't work for men. And they didn't cite any research to back that up that I could find in their documents, probably because there is no evidence for it. The tools ask straightforward questions about low mood, about insomnia, about appetite, about loss of interest, poor concentration, all very concrete symptoms that even if all men had no concept of emotions, and of course they do have, but even if none of you was able to tell the difference between joy and sadness, or between happiness and tearfulness, even if you couldn't do that, you would still know about concentration and appetite and weight gain and interest. You would know about those concrete things. And these are the questions that these questionnaires put to people. So they were questioning the fact that men have lower rates of depression than in women, because they want to say that men and women are absolutely the same. The goal is quite simple. They want to say men and women are absolutely the same. They bring nothing to society that women don't bring, so we don't need men. That's the kind of thinking that I believe is driving this. And it leads us to the question, are fathers important? Because if men are exactly the same as women and don't bring anything different, if they have the same levels of depression as women, if they have the same brain structure as women, and that's a whole controversial area. The brains of men different, do they process information differently? And it's a minefield. I'm not going to touch it because you would need to be a neuroscientist to fully understand it. I don't fully understand, it's very complex. But anyway, so the question is, if there are no differences, and feminists will say that the neuroscientists who say there are differences in the brain structure at a sort of a microscopic level that distinguish men from women, feminists don't want that because they say men are all the same. So if men and women are all the same in every respect, why do we need fathers? And David, in his introduction, mentioned the role of fathers and the importance of fathers. And third wave feminism, which we're just coming out and going into fourth wave. Third and fourth wave are quite similar, except that fourth wave rely more on social media. Third wave. So first wave were the feminists in the 1920s getting the votes and all of that. Second wave would be the Gloria Steinem and Mary Kellys of the world, although Mary has since changed in significant ways. That would be the second wave that were there in the 60s and 70s. And that Australian woman who is probably one of the best known ones, even though I can't remember her name.
What? Greer.
Germaine Greer, yes. And the third wave then were those from about 95 onwards, who were much more radical. And this group, ecofeminism, postmodern feminism, sex positivism, supporting pornography as part of sort of women's choices and explored the right of women to explore their own sexuality. That's third wave feminism, and they believe that women don't need men, society doesn't need men. And if we don't need men, do we need fathers? And Barack Obama, on Father's Day, during his, I think it was his second presidency, commented on the value of fathers, that we shouldn't be undermining fathers, we should not be cutting them out of children's lives, that they were important to children. And one of the best writers on this topic is Brad Wilcox from the United States. He's not the only one, of course, but he writes very well on this, and he's the one I have read most on it. And he sees their role as, firstly, they're providers. They are still, in most homes, the main breadwinners. At least in the US, they're the main provider in 75% of homes in the US. Understanding the male way of thinking and their distinctive parenting styles is particularly important for daughters, because how else will a young girl understand men if she doesn't have a father that...
Sorry, when you turn away from the microphone, it's hard to hear you.
I'll take it in my hand then. I'm sorry about that. Okay, sorry about that. Did some of you miss some of what I was saying? Okay, I'll hold it here. Yes, so they're just, how are girls going to be able to negotiate, to deal with boys in later? If they have brothers, they learn something, but the brothers will be young and immature just like them. So girls need adult men to teach them how adult men behave, the good and the bad in adult men. It's thought that indeed the playfulness of fathers with their daughters, and there's research on this, that fathers who play with their daughters and maybe engage in horseplay actually protects them from early sex. It maybe teaches them that you can actually have physical contact with a man that isn't necessarily sexual, and that may help girls to negotiate when they're confronted with unwanted sexual advances at a young age. It also helps them to deal with disputes when they see their parents having disagreements, and I'm not suggesting that they should be exposed to major disagreements. Children should be protected from that. But the minor disagreements that husbands and wives have all the time, don't talk to me about it, you know, it's, we all go through it. But if you see that being resolved in the way that partners do, that will help them. It minimizes the risk of child sexual abuse if there is a biological parent present in the child's life. Non-biological parents, non-biological men are the greatest abusers of children. That's the scenario, the setting in which most child sexual abuse occurs. Not all, but most, and there is pretty solid evidence for that. So having a resident father who's biologically attached to the child provides protection. And I notice that whenever there's a debate on this, feminists would say it happens in the family, so we have to dismantle the family, the traditional family of two parents where they have biological children. That's actually, they're actually wrong in that, but it's a deliberate attempt again to break the ties between men and women and between fathers and their children, biological fathers and their children. They also share child care, of course, and as I said, the evidence, they protect their daughters from early sexual activity. Now, what about mental disorder and the minimization of mental disorder? One of the things that, and it really, really bugs me, when people say men need to express their emotions more. Part of the masculinities program that was introduced in 1995 in Ireland, and that you hear all the time in the media, men need to be able to talk and express their emotions better. And if they did that, they wouldn't be dying by suicide as much, and they wouldn't be abusing substances. Now, when you actually look at the data, it begs the question, because depressive illness is much more common in women than in men. That's why the APA questioned it, because they didn't want it to be. They in fact said that there was a lot of silent depression that couldn't be detected by these screening tools, which again is wrong. So depressive illness is more common in women than men. Stress disorders like PTSD are more common in women than in men. Eating disorders are more common in women than in men. And talk about expressing your emotion. Emotionally unstable personality disorder is much more common in women than in men, as is deliberate self-harm. With men, we have the problems of substance misuse, in particular including alcohol misuse. Slightly more schizophrenia in men than women, but in terms of overall mental health problems, schizophrenia occurs in 1 to 2% of the population. So in terms of numbers, we're talking of quite small numbers. Antisocial personality disorder, and of course suicide, as we know, is more common in women than in men, while self-harm is
men and women. More common in men than women.
Suicide. Suicide. Yes, sorry, but yes, I meant, yes, of course it is, that's a slip of the tongue, suicide, and I'll show you a graph, I think, next. Yes, here we are. This is the Irish rates. Green is female, male, and the overall rate. And you can see that female rate is much smaller than the male rate. Both have been declining in recent years. The female rate has declined slightly from a low rate anyway. These are per 100,000, by the way. In 2004, the suicide rate in men was around 20 per 100,000. I think the highest ever was in 2000, but the figure for that wasn't in this graph that I copied. In 2000 it was 22.4. So that was the highest rate ever since recording began. So 20, and it is now down to around 14 per 100,000. And the rate for women started at just slightly less than 5 per 100,000 and went to about still a bit more, slightly less than 5. So overall it's declining, and the biggest decline is in men, and that's a good thing. We think that, well, there are two possible reasons for that. One is that we used to be a nation of heavy drinkers, we still are, but the alcohol consumption in young people seems to be declining in recent, well, is declining according to Eurostat statistics in recent years. So that might be one contributor, because we know that heavy alcoholism is associated with suicide. But the other reason is that a few years ago, about 5-6 years ago, the government introduced into every hospital in Ireland, it's a national programme, a self-harm assessment service. Because it was found that a lot of people who self-harmed, who took overdoses or cut themselves or attempted to sometimes shoot themselves or whatever, were coming into the emergency department and not being properly assessed. leaving before they were seen. Some were seen by people who weren't trained in doing proper biological, social and psychiatric assessments. So this program was introduced across the country. I head the program for it in the Mater Hospital. We have the highest rate of self-harmers in the country. Our St. James is the busiest in the country. And this service has dedicated, trained clinical nurse specialists carrying out assessments on every single person that presents with any type of self-harm. And that is now, there's now a statutory register of self-harm run by the Office for Suicide Prevention in Ireland. But because everybody is now getting these detailed and in-depth assessments that can take an hour and a half with follow through afterwards, it's thought that people who were actively suicidal and were being missed in the past are now being picked up and channeled immediately into treatment. And that's good. It's still, of course, too higher than we want it to be, but there is progress there. Now, why might suicide, and the only country in the world where suicide is more common in women than in men is China. In every other country in the world, it's men outnumber women. And why might that be? Well, the men who die by suicide use violent means usually. They jump off hospital windows, we had somebody do it in the Mater recently. So they jump off balconies, or they get through windows, they use shotguns, they hang themselves, so very violent means. And it's difficult to intercept a violent method once you've started. With overdosing, which is what women do, if women use the same methods of self-harm, which they usually use overdosing, but if they were using the same methods for self-harm as men do, they would have the same suicide rate. And clinically, what we found clinically is that self-harm is usually very impulsive. It's not done with the intention of causing death. It's often done because the person, in the immediate, they haven't a plan, but at that moment they feel they'd be better off dead, and they take an overdose. And then halfway through swallowing the tablets, and it's why there are blister packs, it slows you down. If you had a bottle that you could open and just swallow them back, you would take a lot of tablets at one fell mouthful. If you have a blister pack or a bottle that's difficult to open, and if you get paracetamol now, it's actually quite difficult to open bottles. That's why bleach bottles as well. It's impossible to open bleach bottles if you want to clean something. So people in a crisis with poor impulse control, because they're young men or young women, taking an overdose, you can stop after the mouthful, or you can spit them out when you can't swallow. They taste horrible anyway. So that actually saves women from dying by suicide. But men who tend to be more impulsive and more aggressive, probably because of the testosterone, they use violent methods, and it's very difficult to intercept an attempted hanging. I had one about 3 weeks ago, a young man, after an acute problem arose, and he tried to hang himself, but he did manage after about 5 seconds to intercept it, because he changed his mind. So I think that a lot of the suicides in men are because they're using violent methods. It's not that they actually they have a plan. They don't. And they're usually young men. Young men also abuse a lot of drugs. A lot of the suicide in young men is drug related. They're taking cocaine, they're taking cannabis. When they're on the high from cocaine and then they come down from it, they can become profoundly depressed and on impulse harm themselves. So we're not talking, the modern pattern of suicide, the modern context of suicide isn't somebody, except in elderly people are at risk of suicide. occur in the context of some acute crisis in the person's life, an acute problem, like usually a row with somebody. There may be drinking alcohol and taking a mix of drugs, because drugs are ubiquitous now in villages, not just in inner city Dublin, but in villages in Ireland. And when people are upset and distressed, they will often drink for consolation. They may be into drugs if they're young people. We know that the brain of young people aren't fully developed until in men about 18 to 20. Sorry, in men about 20 to 25, in women 18 to 20. So they're more impulsive. The frontotemporal lobes, which is the part that controls planning and organisation, isn't fully developed until those ages. Or it develops later in young men than in young women. So we have these impulsive people in the context of an acute row, maybe into drugs and alcohol, and they see on the spur of the moment little hope and resort to this. Also, they will often not have strong male role models. They'll be mixing in a subculture that is like them taking drugs. A lot of them come from very broken families, and many of them, I would say 80% of the self-harm people we see in the Mater Hospital in the context of drug misuse have been sexually abused. And they've been sexually abused because they come from broken families with no constant male role model. And men use avoidance coping, usually. Women use approach coping. They go to somebody and tell them there's a problem. Men, when there's a problem, avoid it and say, it'll be all right. You know, my sons coming up to their leaving cert, couldn't get them to study. I'd be in my study writing a paper, preparing for a talk like this. I'd look out, I'd see them climbing the trees outside, and I'd shout out, for goodness sake, come in boys, you've your leaving cert next week. It'll be all right, I'm doing fine. So that's avoidance coping. So suicide is more common in men for a variety of very complex reasons. But if we're now getting on top maybe of the alcohol problem, and getting on top of their impulsivity by assessing them when they come into hospital, that I think is helping. So we do need more of all of that, and we especially need more to help men with drug problems who've been sexually abused. They're a very common but complex group to deal with. The gender pay gap. Now, it's not on the programme for today, but I couldn't resist dealing with it because it's all over the place, the gender pay gap. And it's all over the place because, again, men are being cast as the villains, the patriarchy who are earning more. Words like male privilege. Male privilege is linked in the minds of people to the gender pay gap. Women are victims of institutional patriarchy who are deliberately going out of their way to, even though it's illegal in this country to pay different amounts. So the Eurostat, Ireland, the gender pay gap in Ireland, when you take just the crude figure, which is what people take when they talk about this, the crude figure, you take 1,000 men and 1,000 women, and calculate what they're earning. The average would be 13% less than women. Okay, so Ireland isn't too bad. Look at Sweden, which is the darling of the liberal media. Their gender pay gap is higher than ours. Australia, a country that isn't normally associated with equality or sort of being woman-friendly and liberal. Slovenia has the lowest gender pay gap. So let's take a look. By the way, you can have these slides afterwards if you want. I have no difficulty releasing them. I saw some of you taking pictures to save you the hassle of that. Just we'll give them to you. I think most of you probably are online, so can I leave the slides with you, James? Yeah, great, and Dave will sort them out. This is from the our own Central Statistics Office data. Sorry, American Central Statistics Office data. Over 250,000 working 40 hours or more. Fewer women working 40 hours or more. So that would create a gender pay gap because they'd be working fewer hours. I mean, you don't have to be a professor of psychiatry to know that, you know. My cat would know that probably if I told her. 41% of married men work full time. Only 12.9% of married women do so. A lot of people might think I'm here because I'm a stay-at-home mother and I want women to stay at home. I'm not a stay-at-home mother. I've worked full-time all my life, and I had 2 children, and a husband, and cats, and a dog. So, you know, I'm not coming to this as somebody who believes that we should all be staying at home. And, you know, some women do want to stay at home, and I respect that, but it wouldn't have been for me. And the average age, the gender pay gap gets greater as you get older, according to the Eurostat figures. And of course that is because as women get older, they form relationships, they marry, they set up home, they have children, and they opt to stay at home to be with them. Or they opt to work shorter hours because that's what they want to do. Yes, sorry.
Sorry, can I just query those statistics? There was a report in the Irish Times earlier this year about the gender pay gap.
Yeah.
And they stated categorically, now I know it's STEM graduates, but STEM graduates, female STEM graduates between the ages of graduation and 30, get paid at least 2,000 more than their male compatriots. It's only after the age of 30 that they start, because their priorities may change or they may shift. But before the age of 30, they get paid over 2,000 more than their male compatriots.
Yeah. Well, this isn't just focusing on STEM graduates.
No, I
you know, this is the total from the US. Honest, when was that? I must have a look at that because that's interesting.
If I get your email address, I can find it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. I'll do that. Am I running over time or not?
Just a few minutes.
Yes. Right. This is a study. This is a study just published last year that examined the reasons for the pay gap, and it concluded that job characteristics contributed 10% to the wage gap, so contributed a huge amount to the wage gap. So women may be working in lower paid jobs because that's what they're opting for. So if you're say a graduate man, you're most likely to be graduating probably in the sciences, in law, those areas which are higher earning than arts degrees, for example. So the job characteristics contribute 10% to the gender pay gap. So that's the study just worth reading. And there are also other there are wage determining characteristics. The people who complain about the gender pay gap talk about institutional discrimination, but there's no evidence for that. And as I've already said, differing career choices with differing salaries, different work-life balances between men and women, and then if women take maternity leave, that of course will play a role if they go back to work in there, because they would have been behind for a year or 2 or whatever they take to their promotion. So there are all of these factors. So the statistics aren't comparing like with like in many instances, at least when the media present it. Briefly, I want to talk about the recognition that in the court system, and I've come across this myself when I've been dealing with men and women in my, I do a medical legal practice, so in courts I've seen this, and it's now being introduced the concept of parental alienation syndrome into the World Health Organization classification of psychiatric disorders. Now, I don't think it should be. Not because it's not real, but because I think it's a behaviour between people, and I think behaviours of this sort shouldn't be labelled as disorders needing interventions from psychiatrists. I think they need other interventions, but not psychiatric interventions. But it is a recognition. It is a recognition that parents do alienate when there are relationship problems. Parents do set about alienating children from usually the father. And it's defined as the behaviour of one parent against another, whereby they deliberately estrange a once-loved parent from their children during an acrimonious separation. Now, if the alienation is due to abuse or neglect, it wouldn't meet the criteria, because obviously if a parent is abusive or neglectful or cruel, you wouldn't expect the child to, and you would actually probably discourage them from having a relationship with the parent. So that is it. The problem is that increasingly judges here, they talk to the children, and if the child has already had a negative perspective given to them on their father, it's likely that they report that they won't actually give a true account to the judge of how they really feel or felt about their father. They will give it in terms of what they have been usually manipulated into doing, and as a consequence, it might come into play in affecting judgments. 1 minute, right? Can we go on? Yeah, next one, please. We just skipped that one. Right. So finally, the situation is we're throwing everything at men. They're toxic. According to the APA, it's proven. They're not important. All we need is love and women. They're not important because they're the same as women. They contribute nothing to it. They're earning more than women, and so they're part of the patriarchy and must be taken down. Let's not bother why they're dying by suicide. And our courts are torn and don't enforce access. Why can't a man be more like a woman, recalling the opposite of what Henry Higgins said? There's this book that I want to recommend to you. You can go across to Eason's and buy it. A lot of you probably have it, The Madness of Crowds by Douglas Murray. Anybody got the book or heard about it? Yeah. Have all of you heard of Douglas Murray? Yeah. He's a very interesting man, atheist, gay, but writes in The Spectator, and he has written a super chapter on this book, The Madness of Crowds, on women. And I end by just a few quotes. He writes about the world. A woman called Salma El-Warandi, who wants to dismantle patriarchy, and she has developed the concept of men are trash, and there's a hashtag, and that's fourth wave feminism used in the media. Men are trash. He talks about the new misandry and some of the words that are used to shame men, like manspread, mansplaining. He talks about the concept of patriarchy, the idea that people, largely in Western capitalist countries, live in a society which is rigged in favour of men with the aim of surpassing women and their skills. This concept has become so ingrained that when it is mentioned, it now floats by as though the idea that modern Western societies are centred around and run solely for the comfort of men, and that this is not something that anybody would bother to dispute. So patriarchy. Toxic masculinity is mentioned, and then he questions, does a form of toxic femininity exist, etc. Thank you very much indeed.